one of the greatest accomplishments as a nation and as a people, it seems to me, is that we have come to realize and to recognize that our legacy is about learning and teaching and helping our children and grandchildren to find a better life and a better place because we have made our contributions. And further, in the words of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, we have a responsibility, individually and collectively, to encourage our youth never to lose their zeal for building a better world. Not to lose their zeal for building a better world. Good morning. Let me hasten to thank the leadership of the Journey Through Hallowed Ground for the very kind invitation to be with you this morning, to the Honorable Mayor, other distinguished members of the government of this great city of Frederick, to the volunteers and the corporate sponsors, to the parents and the guardians and the teachers of this nation's greatest wealth, our youth, to my colleagues with the Department of Interior and the National Park Service, to all of you, I bring you the warmest of greetings on behalf of the Secretary of the Department of Interior, the Honorable Ken Salazar. But in a real sense, I'll bring to you greetings on behalf of the President of these United States, President Obama. It has, as been noted, been my great joy, my great privilege, my great honor to have been associated with the Journey Through Hallowed Ground since 2006, and certainly to be at Harpers Ferry Historical Park in 2009, in launching or introducing the premier podcast that set into motion a great award-winning program that is indeed nationally recognized as a premier way of teaching our young people about the richness of our nation. And yes, it is national, and I believe soon to go international. So I cannot utter more profoundly a sense of gratitude and privilege to have been associated, because the individuals who forged and who structured this magnificent program are truly dedicated to our young people, dedicated to the betterment of our communities. I will attempt to offer just a very few perspectives, because I am anxious, as you are, for the unveiling of the podcast on Antietam and the C&O National Historical Park. And I'm sure that you will share, as I did in 2009 at Harpers Ferry, a renewed spirit in what can be done when young people are connected with their heritage, known as our national historical parks, historic sites, and other cultural resources entrusted to individuals, state, and local governments. With respect to sharing with you some of my experiences that I would hope would reinforce the importance of the work that the young people are carrying out. I would be remiss not to acknowledge, having spent some 35 years with your National Park Service, stepping down as director in 2001, not to again acknowledge those who every day adorn the green and gray and are stewards of our collective resources, the finest men and women in the federal government. I owe a great deal of thanks to someone who structured the program that allowed me to precede one of my heroes. He had been mentioned more than once this morning. He is a preeminent historian, an interpreter extraordinaire, and a friend of long standing. He'll be addressing you later in the program, none other than Dennis Fry, my friend. It had also been mentioned that I was asked by the President through Secretary Salazar to return to the Department of Interior. And this is the first time I had worked at the departmental level. All of my employment with the Department of Interior was with one beloved bureau, the National Park Service. So while I was at the National Park Service, obviously I took a lot of pride and a lot of parochialism and a lot of biases in saying that it was indeed the lead bureau within the Department of Interior. Now I have to be a little cautious because there are 10 bureaus and offices, and I have to share my love equally. But since I'm among friends, all of us know that the Park Service is still the flagship of the Department of Interior. But again, for the sake of full disclosure, I flunked retirement not once but twice. First as the regional director for the National Capital Region, and then secondly as a director. So when I was sharing with my family, my wife and my 2 children and my grandson, that I had been asked to return to the government, I mentioned it to my wife. She said, "No problem, you're useless around the house anyway." And my kids say, whatever. And my grandson looked at me with a little bit of bewilderment. He said, "Pops, I know that you're really into this thing called conservation and preservation and sustainability, but Pops, aren't you taking this recycling business a little bit too far?" So I do stand before you quite candidly as an humble, recycled public servant. Just briefly to some perspectives on the importance of the work of the journey and the young people. No question, all of us are mindful that we stand in the midst of a decade in which we pause to celebrate, to commemorate, and to rethink the consequences and how we have been able to advance the letter and spirit of our Constitution by some significant developments in this nation. It had been described more than once as one, if not the most defining period in our collective history, the U.S. Civil War. I was with Park Service officials, the mayor of Charleston and others, last year as we stood on the banks of Charleston and subsequently took a boat to Fort Sumter to reflect on the firing on Fort Sumter, perhaps ignited the Civil War. But my hero, whom the students know and have learned, commented perhaps the real start of the Civil War. There was a pivotal point in history that reminded us that perhaps there are some things that are not right. And that was with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And our hero, Mr. Frederick Douglass, made that observation perhaps. That was really the beginning of the Civil War. If we were to from the Civil War, we would think about other major events that have occurred that are continually reflected in the work of the young people. I am convinced that had not there been the Civil War, we may not, as a nation and as a people, enacted in 1865 the 13th Amendment, abolishing that peculiar institution known as slavery. Subsequently, with the enactment of the 14th Amendment, giving all born on these lands full citizenship and equal protection under the law, followed by the enactment of the 15th Amendment that gave to all of us, with the exception of women and those yet to reach the age of 18, the right to vote. But as the lessons have been constructed by the young people, they know that while we committed ourselves to the letter and the spirit of the 13th and 14th Amendment, intellectually and emotionally, perhaps we're not prepared to live up to our constitutional commitment. Two examples, quite candidly, that fully illustrate that. The unanimous decision handed down by the Supreme Court in 1954, referencing the intent and the spirit of the 14th Amendment, that we find that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. All of my childhood and young adulthood was in segregated schools. So the question still remains in my mind, from the enactment of the 14th Amendment up until 1954, why did it take so long for me to have equal access to equal education? Why did it take so long? Fast forward to 1964, again embodied in the letter and the spirit of the 14th Amendment. I was not even up until the age of 23, permitted in my segregated home state of Texas to enter the front door to order a cup of coffee where my mother served as a short order cook until the 1964 Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Johnson. So yes, my friend, the journey to hallowed ground remind us of the sacrifices and the struggles that so many made, that has given us a foundation, given us a point of encouragement to continue to live up to that noble document that has served us so well, and at the last counting has been amended 27 times to move us a little bit forward to we the people in order to form a more perfect union. Something's poetic about that, but good poetry requires sweat, equity, hard work. The lessons being developed and taught by our young people, I believe, move us a little further in that direction. But they will also tell you that even before the enactment of those amendments resulting from the Civil War, there were many of our ancestors of all denominations, all economic backgrounds, and all persuasion, attempted to find that thing called freedom, called justice. Mr. Douglass was one of those, whose legacy is prominently told at Harper's Ferry and at the Douglass Historic Site, Washington, D.C. We know certainly of Clara Barton, tendering to the wounded, may they be Confederate or Union, knowing that we all have something to give because of our humanity. Certainly we know of Sojourner Truth. We know of Harry Tubman, considered the conductor of an Underground Railroad, and that story is interwoven with the Hallowed Ground. And as I stand before you, Congress has considered legislation that would designate the Harry Tubman National Historic Site, an outstanding lady born into the institution of slavery on the southern shores of this great state, Maryland. These are lessons that our young people are addressing. Indeed, these are hallowed ground. Let me close on a couple of perspectives because, again, I'm anxious for the unveiling of the magnificent work created by our young people. Think about your federal government. Think positive about your federal government. Think about the wisdom of our creators of the three branches. And think about the Supreme Court. It doesn't make laws, it doesn't enforce laws. It interprets what we meant when we said certain things under our Constitution. And the work that the young people are about is trying to interpret, why did this happen? What does it mean to me? What are the contemporary lessons that I've learned? And that's the role of your National Park Service, interpreting the historical significance of those sites within Hallowed Ground. And it is absolutely wonderful, my friends, to behold your federal government and its responsibilities that are vested in your Department of Interior and your National Park Service. Your Department of Interior administers some 500 million acres of land, and out of that, roughly 90 to 94 million acres comprise the U.S. National Park System, with some now 397 parks, extending from the War in the Pacific National Historical Park in Guam to Monocacy National Battlefield here in Frederick, from Denali National Park in Alaska to the U.S. Virgin Islands National Park on St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands. But if you were to take a look at the congressional intent of enacting legislation designating these 397 areas, perhaps between 2/3 and 3/4, specifically speak to something about us as a people and as a nation. It says something about the evolution of us in terms of our continuing thirst and search for doing the right thing. What has kept me encouraged? If you were to take a look at the areas that have been added in the past 2, 3, 4 decades, they represent a recognition of the inclusiveness of us as a people in a society, a full recognition of the contribution of women, of Asian Americans, American Indians, African Americans. We're now a nation of over 300 million, and all of us and our ancestors have contributed. But the other thing that has kept me encouraged, if you were to take a look at the growth of the National Park System in some of the areas that have been added in that relatively short span of time, They are places that reflect upon some of the more difficult, some of the most heart-wrenching events in our history. Obviously, we know about the Civil War, but certainly think about the War of 1812. Think about the Revolutionary War, the westward expansion. Think about the fight for equal rights, for quality education. Think about the atrocities, yes, atrocities that we wrought on first Americans, American Indians, if you will. Think about the fear that we had that because of our presumed allegiance that they may have to their native country of Japan, that we did in fact intern and put it bluntly, imprison fellow Americans because we thought of their allegiance might be to someone else. So we tell that story at Manzanar, National Historic Site in the deserts of Southern California. We tell about the atrocities we wrought on American Indians at the Battle of Little Bighorn or Sand Creek Massacre. We talk about the blood shed, obviously, at Antietam. We talk about perhaps one of the most distinguished and honorable members of Congress who was almost killed at the age of 20 when he was marching from Selma to Montgomery to plead for the right to vote as guaranteed by the Constitution, Congressman John Lewis. So it can be said that these are sad places, are difficult places. But the preeminent historian, whom I got to know and to respect, when he, at my request and endorsed by Secretary Bruce Babbitt and President Clinton, served as the chairman of the National Park System Advisory Board, a congressional authorized board to advise the Secretary and Director of Park Service on policies and the programs of the Park Service. And this preeminent historian made the observation, which really I think underscores the values of not only reflected on the most positive periods in our history, but those difficult periods. In the words of Dr. John Hope Franklin, these places, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Antietam, Manzanar, are not places in which we are to wallow in remorse, but rather, my friends, to be moved to a higher resolve to become better citizens. When all is said and done, when all is said and done, that is why we preserve, that is why we commemorate, that is why we love these places of honor, these places of sacrifice. And through those experiences, we become better citizens. We become a better people. We become more of a caring nation. We are very proud of the National Park System, but mostly proud of the partners and those who join with the paid staff on a day-to-day basis, such as the leadership of the Journey to Hallowed Ground partners, and to the over 150 to maybe 180,000 volunteers and other partners who join with the men and women of the Park Service daily in caring for the richness of these people. My closing comments will be directed to really those who honor us with their presence today, the young people. You are in an age of advanced technology. You are able to convey messages across the ocean, next door, or to your fellow students in the next classroom. You're able to access more information than I could in a week in the library in just a matter of a click. So learning and the accessing and the digestion of information is so critical. The process, though, of learning is a continuous basis. And there are several things as you continue to engage in that noble cause of education, is continue to be able to discern the truth from the false, be able to make some judgments based on your understanding. Information dissemination, be mindful of this, is not communication. You have communication when you have understanding. We all can give a lot of information, but without understanding, it is of little value in the end. The great literary critic, author, Matthew Arnold once observed that education is not a getting in heaven, but a rather a growing and becoming. And we are all, irrespective of our chronological age, hopefully are still open to learning. But let me just underscore this process of learning, or this process of education. One of the definition or explanation of the purpose of education, and I would ask you as a classroom assignment or home assignment to Google this, to use that noun as a verb, is the paper entitled The Purpose of Education, written by a 17-year-old college student. President Watt, I was praying at the age of 17, I might get from the 11th grade to the 12th grade. But I'm talking about a 17-year-old college junior who wrote for his college newspaper a brief article on the purpose of education. And I would refer you to this. He underscores the fact that certainly education has as a purpose to develop your emotional and intellectual capacity or your intelligence. But in doing so, if you forego your development and respect for character, you have lost the full essence of education. The real purpose of education is intelligence plus character. That young 17-year-old junior went on to earn his PhD at the tender age of 25, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize at the age of 34, and was taken from us all too soon at the tender age of 38. And on October the 16th, President Obama dedicated on the National Mall a memorial in his honor, Martin Luther King, Jr. And very last, to the students. As was mentioned, I first donned the Park Service uniform as a junior student employed as a seasonal ranger in Grand Teton National Park. And in that year, I met one of this nation's greatest conservationists. And I want to applaud the students, the parents, the guardians, the leadership and the supporters of the journey. In her words, Marty Mary. My father once told me, if you take one step, just one step, with all the knowledge you have, you generally will find at the end enough light to take the next step. To our beloved students, I am prepared publicly to announce I am prepared to take the next step with you. Congratulations. And thank you again for this grand opportunity. Oh,